The following is a non-profit fan reading that is not officially associated with Neil Peart, his family, his publisher, or the other members of Rush. Out of respect for the author, the entirety of the original text will not be presented here. If you would like to learn more about Neil Peart, his written works, or the music of Rush, please click the links in the description.
Chapter 3. Road to Inuvik. Parking my motorcycle in front of a motel at the end of a long day on the road could certainly be sweet, like finally exhaling after holding my breath all day. But best of all was setting out in the morning. Whatever torments the night had brought, whatever weather the new day threw at me, when I loaded up the bike and swung my leg over the saddle, my whole perspective changed. Focus tightened into the mechanics and mentality of operating the machine, and awareness contracted to that demanding paradigm. As I let in the clutch and turned the throttle, my worldview expanded as I moved into a whole new paradigm of landscapes, highways, and wildlife. Infinite possibilities. Travel writers often feel compelled to try to explain and justify the difference between being a tourist and being a traveler. They cite the etymology of travel in the French word travail, labor, and point out that any independent journey outside the well-worn tourist routes requires extreme will and endurance simply to keep moving forward. One of the most serious travelers, Paul Theroux, explains that after one of his journeys, he hasn't had a vacation, he needs a vacation. But for most of his readers, the armchair travelers, it's only the vicarious, pristine experience they want to share, not the unhygienic, exhausting reality. The solitary traveler is frequently invested by others with an aura of romance, myth, and desire. So many people feel trapped in the workday predictability of their lives, and their frustrations and dissatisfactions can be simultaneously stimulated and soothed by a nonspecific fantasy of getting away. But like all fantasies, this dream vision remained free of consequences. And that alone was the deep, cold distinction between fantasy and reality. No consequences. Watching a movie or reading a novel might make you feel sad or frightened or inspired, but at the end of that experience, nothing has actually happened in your life. The experiences of real life were not like that, as I had certainly come to know. The fantasy image of a free spirit drifting without care or effort through some IMAX movie of breathtaking scenery not only ignored the darker possibilities, like breakdown, accidents, injuries, or death, it also omitted the simple joy killers of bad weather, indigestion, toothache, or diesel in your fuel tank. Anything can happen, and scenery is never neutral. So if I always felt a quiet thrill as I set off into the mysteries of a new day, it was often tempered by such realities, both potential and immediate. Leaving Muncho Lake before 6 on a chilly overcast morning, for example, the danger was potential, but the cold was immediate. I wore my full foul-weather outfit of long underwear under the armored leather suit, heated vest and hand grips on a full, thin balaclava under my full-face helmet, and the plastic rain suit over it all helped shield me from the cruel wind. A different journey was beginning as I left behind the relatively secure environment of highways and cities and struck off into remote areas of rough roads and widely scattered little settlements. From that day on, I felt less like a traveler and more like an adventurer, or misadventurer, for I was very much aware that out here the consequences of pilot error or accident were increasingly severe. Fear was my co-pilot, and there was much to worry about now, in both imagination and reality. Highway construction, or rather deconstruction, was the day's first obstacle. When I saw the pavement ending at a long stretch of soft-looking dirt, I held myself tense and breathless as my wheels plowed into the deep, heavy morass of ruts that could easily knock me down. For several miles, my eyes were focused on nothing but the brown dirt approaching my wheels, steering towards the more packed-down areas as smoothly as I could, easy on the brakes, easy on the gas, balance, balance, balance. Then came the day's first reward. As I crossed a bridge above the river, I glanced down and saw something large and dark in the middle of the water. It seemed to be swimming across, trailing a V-shaped wake of silver. So I slowed down for a better look. At first it resembled a cow, but that seemed unlikely, so I decided it was probably a moose and slowed down even more, then put my feet down and stopped to watch. As the dark mass reached the far shore and climbed up on the bank, my eyes widened as I saw that it was a huge black bear, shaking itself and lumbering off into the forest. The characteristic birds of the far north were the ravens flapping heavily across the gray sky, and occasionally a spruce spruce standing dumbly at the roadside. The morning seemed gradually to brighten a little, and I began to hope that some solar warmth might ease my shivering, but the day remained bitter. I stopped at a roadside clearing for a break, and as I looked over the expansive view of the river and its banks of green and yellow forest, a big RV pulled in behind me. Its driver, a friendly older man, came over to look at my bike and told me he owned a BMW back in 1960, and now rode a Honda Goldwing back home in southern Illinois. As we discussed our travels, I learned that he and his wife were on their way home from Alaska, and when I told him I was thinking of heading off the highway that day to some gravel roads, he hooked a thumb back towards the RV and said with a rueful smile, "She won't let me leave the highway." The destination I had in mind was Telegraph Creek, because, well, I like the name. I first heard of it in an article in Equinox, the magazine of Canadian Discovery, now defunct, unfortunately, in which the writer had pointed out that mapmakers seemed to like Telegraph Creek because it gave them a name to put on an otherwise empty region, where northern British Columbia met the Alaska Panhandle. The settlement had flourished briefly twice. First during the Klondike Gold Rush when it was the head of navigation for steamboats carrying hopeful prospectors up the Stikine River. From there, they could travel overland to the Yukon goldfields on what became known as the Bughouse Trail, its history replete with Jack London-style tales of starvation, scurvy, frostbite, and madness. The town's second life, and the source of its name, came from an American scheme to run a telegraph cable overland through Alaska, under the Bering Strait, and across Russia to connect with Europe. But shortly after surveying was completed, the project was rendered pointless by the laying of the transatlantic cable. Telegraph Creek once again lapsed into a virtual ghost town, and the only present-day visitors seem to be attracted by boat, raft, and kayaking expeditions on the Stikine River, or by name. Another siren call for me was the romantic lure of an isolated, storied destination which lay at the end of the world. Telegraph Creek was a dot on the map at the end of a long, unpaved road, far from anywhere, the kind of place Brutus and I used to dream about exploring. In fact, it was Brutus, in a recent telephone conversation, who had urged me to go there. The guidebooks disagreed on whether I would have to navigate 74 miles or 74 kilometers of that road, but they agreed that it was rough and often treacherous. In fact, it turned out to be 112 kilometers, near enough 74 miles, of dirt and gravel winding through deep forest and steep switchbacks up and down the walls of the Grand Canyon of the Stikine. In some places, the sheer cliffs of eroded, multi-layered rock did resemble a modest version of that famed sketch of the Colorado River. And sometimes the road was a mere ledge perched upon those vertical walls, dropping off into a frightening abyss. My journal described it as a scary, scary road, and I was fairly rattled when I pulled up in front of the Stikine Riversong Cafe, general store, lodge, and boat tour headquarters. All of this was housed in one large white frame building facing the swift-moving river. And I later learned that it had been the original Hudson Bay Company trading post, situated just downriver, and had been moved piece by piece to Telegraph Creek. A few other abandoned-looking houses and a small church clustered on the riverbank, but only the Riversong showed any signs of life. The guidebook said that a few rooms were available there, but if they happened to be filled, it would be a long way back to any other lodgings. The cold, gloomy weather made the idea of camping uninviting, but once again I was glad to be carrying my little tent and sleeping bag, especially when the owner told me he was closing for the weekend and taking the staff upriver in his tour boat to celebrate the end of their season. Then, after a moment's thought, he said that I was welcome to rent one of the rooms and stay there on my own. That was thoughtful, hospitable, and trusting of him, and I only asked what I might do for food. He told me there was a kitchen upstairs where I could prepare my own meals. So I bought a few provisions in the general store in the back of the building, including some fresh salmon for the river, and carried my bags to a small bedroom upstairs. I watched through the cafe window as the owner and his 3 employees loaded their camping gear into the motorboat, and my only regret was missing the opportunity for a tour of the river myself. I stood on the riverbank and watched the boat speed away upriver against the strong current, and felt a little excited, and a little fearful. Apparently the only other enterprise, Trina Ann Excursions, was also abandoned for the weekend. So the only living souls in town were the Mountie and his wife at the RCMP post at the other end of town. I was virtually alone in my own private ghost town, watching the river flow. Upstairs in the empty old building, the silence seemed almost oppressive, and only accentuated by the amazingly creaky floors as I walked around between my small bedroom at the front, the shared bathroom, and the common area of kitchen and sitting room. On the payphone, I called Alex on his birthday, and he was pleased to hear from me, though a little bemused by my tale of where I was calling from. The delay on the line made me feel even more like a voice from the wilderness. As I wrote in my journal, well, I fetched up in some strange places in my travels, in some places that were a serious adventure to get to, but this is one of them. I slept soundly with my window open to the cool, fresh air and the murmuring of the river, and took a walk before breakfast on another chilly, overcast morning. Past ruined cabins and abandoned moss-covered cars and pickups from the 1950s, a narrow path led up a high, lava rock cliff above a steep scree to an old graveyard overlooking the town. As I walked among the stones, reading the inscriptions, the bare facts of names and dates had a whole new resonance for me. For I felt them as part of a story like mine, a story of love and loss. I thought about Henry Joe, who had died at the age of 105 and was buried beside Mrs. Joe, who he had outlived by 40 years. Then there were all the babies, children, teenagers, and young men and women, and I found myself weeping for all the lost ones. Theirs and mine. Ghost town indeed. From the payphone at the Riversong, I finally got a call through to Ray to find out what was going on with the sale of the Toronto house. Apparently the day before, while I had been riding out there in the wilderness, unconcerned with any news from the outside world, the stock market had taken its own tumble into the mud. The Canadian dollar had plummeted again, and the formerly committed buyer had found an excuse to back out of the deal at the last minute. Just when I had grown used to the idea of saying goodbye to that haunted house, with all its years of family memories, it was back on the market and back on my mind. Just what I needed. It's hard not to feel like Mr. All-Time Loser sometimes. Rain and despair, bad combination. I had the feeling of being driven to the edge of a deep, dark hole, so to speak, and I became very aware of backing away. Don't go there. More snow-dusted mountains came into view as I approached Dawson at the end of a relatively easy day's ride on a dry, paved highway under sunny skies. It was still early in the afternoon, and I'd only covered 565 kilometers that day. But Dawson was the starting point of the Dempster Highway, and I needed to make some decisions, and maybe some preparations. In any case, it was pleasant having an early end to a day that wasn't quite so epic, and I was glad to check into a Westmark hotel, do some laundry, and walk around town. Except for Front Street, the main road in, all the streets were unpaved and lined with boardwalks. Otherwise, the permafrost would heave the paving up every year like a wrinkled carpet. The boardwalk helped to give the place a real frontier town feeling, along with a couple of genuine older buildings like the courthouse and the bank. Although the main part of the town was a little tarted up for tourists, with Klondike days, saloons, and such, behind the facades, Dawson had the rugged, weather-beaten look of any small town in the far north. Several camper trucks were parked along the levees beside the Yukon River. Among them a few VW microbuses with British Columbia and California license plates. One with a smiley-face tire cover. Neo-hippies. Another attraction in Dawson was the Jack London Center, which commemorated the writer's time in the area as a young prospector during the Klondike Gold Rush in 1897. The stories and novels inspired by that part of his life, including The Call of the Wild and White Fang, had brought him his first success and fame. By chance, I had recently come across a Jack London story in an anthology called The Very Richness of That Past, a collection of writing about Canada by visitors. The title came from a story by another American writer, Wallace Stegner, whose writing I would also come to love after that first taste of his work. The opening of London's story, in a far country, had relevance to my present journey, both literally and metaphorically. When a man journeys into a far country, he must be prepared to forget many of the things he has learned, and to acquire such customs as are inherent with existence in the new land. He must abandon the old ideals and the old gods, and oftentimes he must reverse the very codes by which his conduct has hitherto been shaped. To those who have the protean faculty of adaptability, the novelty of such change may even be a source of pleasure, but to those who happen to be hardened to the ruts in which they were created, the pressure of the altered environment is unbearable, and they chafe in body and in spirit under the new restrictions which they do not understand. This chafing is bound to act and react, producing diverse evils and leading to various misfortunes. It were better for the man who cannot fit himself to the groove to return to his own country. If he delay too long, he will surely die. Back in the hotel parking lot, I talked to a man who had just come back from the Dempster Highway in his Jeep, and he shook his head as he told me that it had been a rough journey, and he had barely made it even in his four-wheeler. Hundreds of miles of dirt each way, he said, with only one gas station in the middle, and there had been some muddy construction zones where he had seen a few other motorcyclists having a hard time, falling down, and pushing each other through the muck. That night, I finally reached my mother on the phone and wished her a happy birthday, and she sounded worried when I told her my plans. After Selena's death, I had leaned on my mom the most, not surprisingly, and my dad had been there for me too, giving me strength and help and comfort when he could. Even after Jackie and I went to London, I had called my mother every day, just needing the refuge of her voice, and recently, when I had apologized for not calling so often, she had said, "That's okay. When I don't hear from you, I know you're all right." She and Dad had come to London to help us through that first awful Christmas and later visited us in Barbados not long before Jackie's passing. Earlier that August, when I hadn't felt up to facing the anniversary of Selena's death by myself, I had ridden my motorcycle across Ontario to Mom and Dad's house to spend the night with them. On the telephone in Dawson, partly to calm her, and partly to calm myself, I made the decision out loud that I would go for the Arctic Circle at least, just over halfway, and turn around the first time I fell down. Neither of us was comforted much by the idea, but at least I had committed myself to a plan. At 9:30 at night, the sun was still hitting the hilltop behind the town, and even that late in the summer, August 30th, and at 10:15, when I was still trying to catch up with my journal writing, I noted that it was still fairly light outside. It was still hard to keep up with this trip, journaling-wise, even when I think I'm taking it easy. Too much happens in a day, as Selena once observed. In late June of 1997, towards the end of the Test for Echo tour, Selena joined Brutus and me on our scooter trash gang for a few days, sleeping on the bus, traveling by motorcycle to the shows, then getting herself all dolled up for showtime. At the end of a show at Great Woods Amphitheater, near Boston, I ran straight off the stage and into the scooter trash bus. Brutus and Selena were already aboard, and our driver, Dave, set off across New England while I dried off and changed, then sat in the front lounge talking and listening to music. Brutus and I raised a glass of the Macallan, and Selena sipped a beer. Soon we melted off to our bunks. Selena claimed that her favorite place to sleep was in the bunk of a moving bus, and jostled through the night in the classic rest of the touring musician. Brutus had chosen a staging area for the next morning's ride in a corner of Maine, and Dave drove to a rest area nearby where we could enjoy some motionless sleep for another few hours. At daylight, I roused the sleepy Selena, and we all crowded into the narrow lounge and struggled into our riding gear. Brutus and I backed the bikes off the trailer, Selena climbed on behind me, and we rode into the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where Brutus had arranged a rendezvous with a helicopter pilot and a videographer. For the next 6 hours, Selena traded her uncomfortable seat behind me on the motorcycle for an uncomfortable seat behind the helicopter pilot, while he performed all kinds of aerobatics for the videographer and Andrew, the still photographer, who didn't much enjoy hanging out the side of the helicopter to shoot pictures of Brutus and me riding together. After that ordeal, poor Selena climbed onto the back of the motorcycle again, and we rode another 6 hours to the Wheatcroft Inn in Lenox, Massachusetts. It was way too long of a day for her, and she was sore and tired and miserable. We all were. However, in one of her greatest moments, within 3 minutes, my little girl had changed from her leather riding suit into a pretty green dress, given her hair a quick updo, and was transformed into her elegant lady persona. Selena the Warrior Princess, we called her. At dinner that night, the three of us were limply good-humored, and Selena kept teasing Brutus about his bad planning and how tired and sore she was. Then, as we discussed the events of that day, Selena shook her head and said, "I can't believe how much can happen in one day." She made me proud. A few days later, before the second half of the show at an amphitheater near Buffalo, New York, Selena was leaving to go back to Toronto, and I said goodbye to her outside the trailer dressing room. As I hugged and kissed her, I told her, "I love you, and I'm proud of you, in so many ways." And the last time I saw her, on the morning of August 10th, 1997, I'd ridden ahead of her on my motorcycle to guide her through the back roads of Quebec to a gas station near Hawkesbury, Ontario. And once again I hugged and kissed her, and told her I loved her, and I was proud of her. Now I was so glad those words had been spoken, and I was grateful for other good memories too. Most of our family travels had tended to be at my convenience, at the end of one of my solo adventures, for example, when Jackie and Selena would meet me in Hong Kong, Nairobi, the Ivory Coast, or Paris, or join me for a break in a rush tour in Boston, St. Louis, or San Francisco. But just the year before, in the spring of 1997, I had taken Jackie alone to Tahiti, Bora Bora, and Moria for a couple of weeks. And at the end of it, she told me that the nicest thing about it was that for the whole time she had felt like she had had all my attention. Typically, I hadn't thought of that as being an important factor, but in retrospect, I was sure glad I had done that. Sometimes, however unknowingly, I hadn't been such a fool. The next morning was dark and gloomy, and I felt tired and worried. The weather forecast had changed from rainy to cloudy, but the locals told me they thought it was going to rain. I was truly fatigued and in need of rest, sore all over from tension and exertion, and I'd hoped to spend a day in Inuvik, way up there at the end of the northernmost road in Canada. Maybe I could find a way to visit Tuktoyaktuk, a nearby Inuit community on the Arctic Ocean. But if it rained heavily, I would be in trouble. There was only one way out again, the Dempster Highway, and if that road was no longer a mystery, it was still an obstacle. On a rainy day, I would not be able to make it, and I could be stuck somewhere for days, unless I hitched a ride out on a truck. So I was afraid, but my fear was not about falling or getting hurt or breaking down or having a flat tire, though those hazards were certainly on my mind. Much more dangerous to me was the idea of being stuck somewhere, with too much time to think and the feeling of being trapped. I decided I would take a chance on one more dry day and make my escape. Just as I started loading the bike, the raindrops began, and I leaned on the doorway, bags in hand, dressed to go. What to do? Stay and wait it out, or go and hope I wouldn't get stuck somewhere? No answer, really. You can't guess the weather. I made a brief circuit of the little town, through the main crossroads with a few stores, another big hotel, and the famed igloo-shaped church, and then filled up with gas and headed south. On the short, paved stretch of road leading out of town, I remembered riding the other way the previous night, feeling proud and exhilarated. Now I was frightened, weak, and weepy, truly dispirited. And as the paving ended, I found myself swearing out loud at the road, the rain, my life, and whatever power might be responsible for all my bad fortune. But lacking the solace of faith, I also lacked anyone to blame.